Respect is loud when you have to buy it. It's silent when you already own it. At 6:52 in the morning, a black woman in a faded gray Georgia Tech hoodie was told by a smiling young man behind a marble counter that she had clearly wandered into the wrong lounge. 40 minutes later, she was standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin, being threatened with handcuffs by a man wearing 4 gold stripes on his shoulders. 90 minutes after that, that same captain, his senior purser, and the gate agent who started it all were standing on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport with their badges deactivated and their careers finished. This is the story of how Josephine Calloway spent one flight teaching an entire airline exactly whose name was now on the deed. Coward. The papers had been signed at 3:52 that morning in a glass conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown Atlanta tower, the kind of room where the air conditioning never quite catches up with the tension. Josephine Calloway, 36 years old, founder and sole owner of Calloway Continental Logistics, had just closed the largest acquisition of her career. $3.8 billion, wired in 4 separate tranches to keep the regulators calm, had bought her Windrose Airlines outright. A boutique carrier with 6 aircraft, a devoted following among people who could afford $11,000 suites, and, as she would soon discover, a culture rotting quietly beneath the champagne and orchids. Her lawyers had popped a bottle of something French in the hallway. Josephine had asked for black coffee and a ride to the airport. She hadn't slept in 31 hours, and every cell in her body wanted exactly one thing: Seat 2A on Windrose Flight 14 to London, a flatbed, a blanket, and 8 hours of silence over the Atlantic. She arrived at the airport at 5:40 a.m., wearing a hoodie soft from 100 washes, black leggings, and a pair of white sneakers that had seen better winters. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot at the back of her head. She carried no handbag, just a scuffed brown leather briefcase holding the signed acquisition documents, and a plain black duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Clipped to the zipper of that duffel, small enough that most people never noticed it, was a tarnished brass keyring shaped like a tiny airplane. It had belonged to her father. Marcus Calloway had worked the ramp at this very airport for 22 years, loading bags into the bellies of aircraft in 95-degree heat and 20-degree cold, invisible to nearly everyone who ever stepped past him in a hurry to board. He used to tell Josephine that the people who ran an airline and the people who built it were rarely the same faces you saw in the brochure. He died on that tarmac on a Tuesday in July, his heart giving out beside a cart of luggage. And it took the airline he'd served for 2 decades, 6 days, to send a letter of condolence that spelled his name wrong. Josephine had kept that letter. She had also kept the keyring. She touched it now, once, the way some people touch a cross. She bypassed the noise of the main terminal and walked toward the frosted glass doors of the Windrose Meridian Lounge, an exclusive first-class sanctuary reserved for the kind of passengers whose names appeared in magazines. The doors slid open onto hushed classical music, the scent of white tea, and a floor so polished it looked wet. Behind a gleaming reception desk stood a young man in his mid-20s named Julian Ferris, his uniform pressed to a knife's edge, his hair combed with a precision that suggested he practiced it in the mirror. When Josephine approached, his professional smile flickered and reset into something colder. His eyes moved over her hoodie, her leggings, the absence of any visible logo she was supposed to be carrying. The calculation took less than 2 seconds. "I'm sorry, miss," Julian said, his voice pitched somewhere between apology and instruction. "But this lounge is reserved for Windrose first-class passengers only. Economy check-in is back through those doors. Second counter, on your left." Josephine didn't blink. She had spent a decade in rooms full of men twice her age who had underestimated her before she ever opened her mouth, and a 25-year-old concierge barely registered on that scale. She reached into her jacket pocket, withdrew a black boarding pass, and set it on the counter beside her passport, without a word. Flight 14 to London. Seat 2A, she said. Her voice was flat, neither warm nor sharp, just fact. Julian looked at the boarding pass. He looked at the passport photo. He's looked at Josephine's face, then back down, as though the paper might change its answer if he stared long enough. A slow flush crawled up his neck. He typed something into his terminal, the keys clicking too hard. "My apologies, Miss Calloway," he said, though the words came out clipped, more annoyed than sorry. "We don't often see our first-class guests dressed so casually. Right this way." Josephine took her documents back without comment. She didn't care about Julian. She cared about a flatbed and 7 hours of silence. She had learned, years ago, that the fastest way to lose an argument you were destined to win was to have it too early. Her mentor, a logistics executive who had given her first real job when she was 22 and broke, used to say that the loudest person in the room is almost always the one with the least actual leverage, and that real power could afford to wait. Josephine had built an entire career on that patience. 3 years, quietly acquiring warehouse contracts nobody else wanted. 5 more, turning a single regional trucking license into a supply chain network spanning 14 states. And, finally, at 34, the kind of balance sheet that let her walk into a boardroom and buy an airline before breakfast. None of it showed on the outside. That had always been the point. Inside the lounge, men in tailored suits read the Wall Street Journal over espresso, and a woman Josephine, vaguely recognized from a streaming series, sat behind oversized sunglasses in a corner booth. Josephine found a quiet pod near the back, plugged in her phone, and closed her eyes. She had no idea that the coldness at the front desk had only been the opening note. The real trouble was already forming at the gate, in a conversation she wasn't part of yet. At gate C14, a scheduling error was being manufactured in real time, though error wasn't quite the honest word for it. Windrose's booking system showed a duplicate reservation for seat 2A. That was a lie. Seat 2A belonged to Josephine Calloway. She'd booked it herself 11 weeks earlier, months before anyone at this airline knew her name. But a very loud, very wealthy man had just arrived at the gate without a reservation at all, demanding the seat he considered his by right. That man was Preston Whitmore, a hedge fund manager whose firm had once poured $40 million into Windrose's parent company and never let anyone forget it. Preston flew first class the way other people breathed. Automatically, and with the assumption that the world would rearrange itself to accommodate him. At the podium, gate agent Denise Falk was already sweating through her collar.
"Preston Whitmore is here?"
she whispered urgently into her headset, eyes darting toward the jet bridge where his voice was already audible. "He wants 2A. He always sits in 2A. On the other end, senior purser Charlene Voss, 23 years with the airline, proud of her instinct for who mattered and who didn't hesitate. Who's currently ticketed in 2A? Denise scanned her screen, a Josephine Calloway. No corporate account flagged, no VIP tier, standard first-class fare. Bump her, Charlene said, flat and final. Tell her there's an equipment change. Push her to premium economy if business is full. I am not spending 8 hours over the Atlantic listening to Preston Whitmore complain because some nobody is sitting in his chair. That's a real violation of the passenger conduct policy, Denise said, hesitating. You can't downgrade a confirmed first-class ticket without documented cause. I don't care about the policy manual, Denise. I care about my pension. Whitmore is close with half the old board. Move the Calloway woman. If she pushes back, offer her a travel voucher and be done with it. The decision took less than a minute. Neither woman knew that the old board Whitmore was so proud of knowing no longer existed, dissolved at 3:52 that same morning. Neither of them knew that the woman they were about to strip of her seat now owned every aircraft on that ramp, every uniform in that terminal, and the paycheck that would land in both of their accounts in 9 days. Keep that number in your head. 9 days, it will matter later. At 6:20, boarding was called for Flight 14. Josephine gathered her briefcase and her duffel, the small brass airplane swinging gently against the zipper, and walked down the private jet bridge reserved for premium passengers. She handed her boarding pass to Denise. The scanner blinked red. A sharp beep cut through the quiet of the bridge, and Denise's expression rearranged itself into practiced professional sympathy. The kind airlines train into their employees for exactly this moment. Miss Calloway, I'm afraid there's been a complication with your seat assignment, Denise said. A complication, Josephine repeated. Yes, due to a last-minute aircraft substitution, Seat 2A is no longer available. We've had to reassign you. Josephine's brow drew tight. She had read every page of the fleet documentation the night before, the way she read everything before she bought it. This aircraft is a Boeing 7879, she said. Windrose operates 4 of them, and none of them have alternate first-class configurations. There is no substitution that changes Seat 2A. Denise blinked, caught off guard by how much this woman in a hoodie seemed to know about aircraft variants, then recovered her script. Regardless, the seat is unavailable. We've secured you a spot in premium economy, and of course we'll issue a travel voucher for the inconvenience. Premium economy, Josephine said, her voice dropping half an octave, quiet and dangerously even. I paid $11,400 for a first-class suite. I am not sitting in premium economy. I'm afraid you don't have a choice, said a new voice. Charlene Voss stepped off the aircraft and onto the bridge, blonde hair sprayed into a helmet that hadn't moved in years, her gaze sweeping over Josephine's hoodie with open distaste. She had handled entitled upgrade requests 100 times before, and this, to her, looked like exactly one more. I'm the senior purser on this flight, Charlene announced. The gate agent has explained the situation. Seat 2A belongs to a VIP passenger. You'll accept the reassignment, or you'll be removed from the manifest entirely. Before Josephine could respond, heavy footsteps thundered down the jet bridge. Preston Whitmore came storming past, flanked by 2 assistants, shouting into his phone loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. I told them to short the position, not sit on it. Absolute incompetence. He snapped his fingers at Charlene without so much as glancing at Josephine. Charlene, darling, tell me my suite is ready. I need a scotch before wheels up. Of course, Mr. Whitmore, Charlene said, her entire posture melting into warm, sycophantic ease. Seat 2A is waiting for you. Right this way. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a person who has decided, in the space of a single breath, exactly how a situation is going to end. It doesn't look like anger. It doesn't look like fear. It looks, mostly, like nothing at all, which is precisely what made it so unnerving to everyone standing on that jet bridge who hadn't yet learned to read it. Josephine watched the exchange with a clarity that cut straight through her exhaustion. She knew Preston Whitmore. 2 years earlier, his fund had tried to short Calloway, Continental, into bankruptcy, betting against her company in a move so aggressive it made industry headlines. Josephine had built a counterposition so precise it cost his fund $410 million in 6 weeks. Preston had no idea who she was right now. To him, she was furniture in his path. You bumped me for him, Josephine said, turning back to Charlene and Denise. There was no equipment change. You canceled a paid ticket to accommodate a man who doesn't have a reservation at all. Charlene's smile vanished. Miss Calloway, lower your voice. Mr. Whitmore is one of this airline's most valued corporate partners. And what am I? Josephine asked softly. Currently, a disturbance, Charlene snapped. You have 2 choices. Walk to seat 31D in premium economy, and be grateful we're accommodating you at all, or I call airport security and have you removed from this terminal." Which is it?" Josephine looked at Charlene. She looked at Denise. She looked at the open cabin door behind them. Inside her briefcase sat the signed documents, proving she owned the very aluminum tube they were all standing beside. She could have opened that briefcase right there on the jet bridge and ended this in 11 seconds. But Josephine Calloway had learned something in a decade of boardrooms that her father never got the chance to teach her himself. Real power isn't about winning the argument in front of you. It's about finding out how deep the rot goes before you decide how much of the building needs to come down. "Fine," she said quietly. "Take me to 31D. Charlene's mouth curled into something like triumph. "I knew you'd see reason. Follow me." Walking through a luxury cabin as a demoted passenger is its own particular kind of public humiliation, and Charlene made a production of it, escorting Josephine past every row like a warden on a tour. They passed Suite 2A, where Preston Whitmore already sat with his shoes off, barking at a junior flight attendant to pour his scotch faster. They passed through business class and finally into the cramped, densely packed rows of premium economy, where the air felt thinner and the smell of someone's tuna sandwich hung heavy over a crying toddler 2 seats away. "Seat 31D, Charlene said, pointing to a middle seat wedged between the toddler and the sandwich. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Calloway." She turned on her heel and marched back toward first class. Josephine stood in the aisle for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had spent 22 years being the invisible hands that made flights like this possible, and who never once, not one single time, got offered a seat like the one that had just been stolen from her. She thought about the $11,400. She thought about the $410 million. She thought, too, about the version of herself who had grown up in a 2-bedroom rental off Campbellton Road, doing homework at a kitchen table while her father soaked his feet in a plastic basin after a double shift, telling her in that low, tired voice that the world would try to put her in the smallest seat it could find, and that the only real answer was to own the plane. "No," she decided, "I don't think I will sit in 31D. Josephine turned and walked straight back up the aisle. A junior flight attendant tried to stop her at the business class curtain. "Miss, you really can't be up here." But she didn't so much as slow down. She pushed through into the hush of first class, where Charlene stood at the galley pouring champagne, and the moment Charlene saw her, her face twisted into open fury. "What do you think you're doing? Get back to your seat now." "I'm going to my seat," Josephine said, her voice carrying clean through the quiet cabin. She stopped directly outside Suite 2A. Preston Whitmore glanced up from his iPad, annoyed.
What is the meaning of this?
"Why is she loitering by my suite?" "I'm handling it, Mr. Whitmore." "I'm so sorry," Charlene stammered, before rounding on Josephine with a look sharp enough to draw blood. "You have crossed a line. You are now interfering with the operation of this aircraft. I'm calling the captain. Watch what happens in the next 90 seconds. It is the moment this entire story pivots on, and almost nobody in that cabin understood it yet." Charlene snatched the interphone and jabbed a button. Less than 10 seconds later, the cockpit door clicked open, and Captain Gregory Holt stepped out. Late 50s, silver hair, 4 gold stripes on each shoulder, and the particular walk of a man who had never once in his career been told no, and meant it. "What's the problem, Charlene?" he asked, his voice pitched to carry, to intimidate. "This passenger," Charlene said, pointing a finger like an accusation, "was downgraded due to operational necessity and is now refusing her reassigned seat and harassing our VIP guest." Captain Holt stepped uncomfortably close to Josephine, using his height the way some men use height, as though proximity were an argument. "Listen very carefully, young lady," he said, his voice a low, practiced rumble. "I am the final authority on this aircraft. My word is federal law the moment those doors close. You are currently obstructing my crew, And if you do not turn around and walk yourself back to premium economy this instant, I will have Port Authority remove you in handcuffs, and I will personally see to it you are placed on a no-fly list with every carrier in this alliance. Are we understood? Josephine didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She glanced down at her watch, a simple, understated steel Cartier that had been her mother's, and it read 7-4. Somewhere behind her, the crying toddler had gone quiet, as if the whole cabin had drawn one collective breath and forgotten to let it out. That is the first frozen moment of this story. The hum of the engines seemed to fade, the smug satisfaction on Charlene's face, the puffed-out authority in Captain Holt's chest, the fear in Denise's eyes as she watched from the galley entrance. All of it hung suspended, waiting for a woman in a faded hoodie to decide what happened next. Josephine reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't dial. She didn't threaten. She simply held it, thumb hovering, and said in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, "Before you make that call, Captain, I'd like you to understand something about the aircraft you're standing in." Captain Holt let out a short, humorless laugh. "And what would that be?" "This aircraft," Josephine said, "along with 3 others in this fleet, 4 Embraer regional jets, and every gate lease this airline holds at this airport, was purchased at 3:52 this morning for $3.8 billion. The acquisition closed under the name Callaway Continental Logistics. I am the sole owner of that company." The cabin, for one full second, made no sound at all. Captain Holt's laugh died somewhere in his throat. That is not possible." "I would have been briefed." "You will be," Josephine said, "in about 4 minutes, once my general counsel finishes forwarding the closing documents to your operations desk. Until then, I'd like you to keep in mind that everything you say to me right now is being said to your new employer." Charlene's face had gone the color of the tablecloth in front of her. This has to be some kind of scheme," she said, though her voice had lost its edge. "People don't fly economy, I mean premium economy, if they own the airline." "My father worked the ramp at Hartsfield-Jackson for 22 years, Josephine said, and for the first time, something in her voice sharpened. "He never once got offered a seat like the one you gave to a man with no ticket at all. So forgive me if I don't dress the way you expect ownership to look." Captain Holt, to his credit or his stubbornness, was not a man built to fold quickly. "I don't care whose name is on a piece of paper," he said, drawing himself up again. "Until it is verified through my company's chain of command, I remain the final authority on this aircraft, and you remain a passenger who has been disruptive. I am calling Port Authority." This is exactly the wrong instinct, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on. A smarter man would have paused. A cautious man would have asked a single question before reaching for the phone again. Captain Holt did neither. He picked up the interphone, 2 rows back, a passenger who had been quietly watching everything unfold. A man in his 30s with a tuna sandwich half finished in his lap. Lowered his phone from where he'd been filming for the last 90 seconds and looked at his wife with wide eyes, saying nothing, doing nothing, too aware of his own economy-adjacent seat and his own lack of power to intervene. That is the silent witness of this story. And he is not a coward so much as an ordinary person doing what ordinary people do when the ground shifts beneath a stranger. He watches, he records, and later, that recording will matter more than any argument he could have made in the moment. Captain Holt's call to Port Authority never finished connecting. Before he could speak, the cabin's overhead lighting flickered, dimmed, and steadied again. The unmistakable signature of ground power being cycled by someone with administrative access to the aircraft's systems. Josephine had not moved. She hadn't touched a single button. Somewhere in a war room 40 floors above downtown Atlanta, her chief operating officer, a sharp, sleepless man named Desmond Wright, had just received her one-word text, "Confirm," and begun locking down every system Windrose Airlines had ever built. "You may want to answer that," Josephine said, nodding toward the captain's radio, which had begun crackling with an urgent voice from operations. Captain Holt lifted it slowly, his face draining of color as he listened. Whatever he heard on the other end, it wasn't a denial. 2 minutes later, a Port Authority officer named Reyes boarded the aircraft, not to remove Josephine, but escorted personally by the airport's duty manager, who had been on the phone with Desmond Wright for the last 90 seconds and understood, with total clarity, exactly which side of this conflict now controlled every gate lease on that concourse. Officer Reyes looked between Captain Holt, Charlene Voss, and the woman in the hoodie standing calmly by Suite 2A, and asked the only question that mattered. "Ma'am, is this the individual who contacted our office about a passenger rights violation?" "It is," Josephine said. "And these three," she nodded toward Charlene, Denise, and Captain Holt, "are no longer employees of this airline as of this moment. I'd like them removed from the aircraft." This is where the second frozen moment of the story lives. Charlene Voss stood absolutely still. The champagne bottle she'd been holding earlier, now set down somewhere behind her on the galley counter, her mouth slightly open, no sound coming out. Captain Holt's 4 gold stripes suddenly looked like the costume they had always secretly been. The curtain separating first class from business class had been pulled back by then, and a dozen phones were already recording. The man with the tuna sandwich among them, no longer silent, no longer just watching, his video already streaming live to a following of 1,100 people who had no idea what they were about to witness. "You can't do this," Charlene said, finding her voice at last, though it came out thin. "I have 23 years with this airline. I built relationships. I know how this business works. You bumped a paying passenger to accommodate an unticketed man because you assumed her clothing told you her net worth." Josephine said, "That's not relationship management. That's discrimination, and as of 9 hours ago, it's my airline's liability, not the old board's." "You don't understand how this industry works," Charlene said, her voice climbing towards something close to panic, though her chin stayed lifted, defiant even now. "There is a hierarchy. There are passengers who matter to the future of this airline, and passengers who fill seats. I have spent 2 decades learning to tell the difference at a glance, and I have never once been wrong." "You were wrong 4 hours ago," Josephine said. "You were wrong about me the moment I walked up to that gate, and you're still standing here explaining to me why you were right to be wrong. That's the part I actually can't forgive, not the mistake. The certainty." Charlene opened her mouth to answer and found, for the first time that morning, that she had nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. "I was protecting a valued client," Charlene said, and there it was. The thing that would define her all the way to the end of this story. She wasn't going to apologize. She believed, with total sincerity, that she had done her job correctly. Somewhere underneath the fear, she still thought the rules had been on her side, and that belief would follow her out the door and off the tarmac and into every interview she'd never get again. Officer Reyes escorted Charlene and Captain Holt off the aircraft first, their exit watched by every recording phone in the business class cabin. A slow procession of shame down a jet bridge that, 90 minutes earlier, they had walked with total confidence. Denise Falk went quietly, silently crying, offering the only words that came close to an apology. Anyone in this story would hear that morning. "I told her it violated policy. I told her," words that wouldn't save her job, but that Josephine, watching her go, filed away as a small, meaningful difference. Preston Whitmore had sunk deep into his leather seat throughout all of this, trying to make himself as small and unremarkable as a man worth $2.1 billion possibly could. When the cabin quieted, Josephine turned to him.
Preston,
she said, catching her own slip with the faintest cold smile, because for a moment he'd genuinely blurred into every entitled man she'd ever outmaneuvered. "We're not doing business today." "Josephine, listen. This is clearly a misunderstanding. The crew overreacted. Let's put this behind us. I'm a significant client of—" "You don't have a reservation on this aircraft," Josephine said. "The crew broke federal passenger protection rules to accommodate a man with no ticket. Because that man once tried to bankrupt my company and lost $410 million, finding out he couldn't. You are banned from Windrose Airlines, from every Callaway Continental subsidiary, and from any property I own, effective immediately. You can't do that. I have a meeting in London in 6 hours. Then I'd suggest you find another airline," Josephine said, and nodded to Officer Reyes. "Please see Mr. Whitmore off the aircraft as well." He didn't fight it. Not really. Just stared at her the way a drowning man stares at shore. Mouth opening and closing, on words that never quite arrived, before being escorted out through the gauntlet of raised phones in business class. His $4,000 luggage dragging behind him like an apology he couldn't bring himself to say. Josephine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding since the jet bridge. Her bones still ached with 31 hours of no sleep. She walked to Suite 2A, pressed the button to recline the seat into a full flatbed, set her duffel on the floor with the small brass airplane resting against the carpet, and lay down. A 23-year-old flight attendant named Maya Okafor, who had been working the premium economy galley an hour earlier and had just been given an emergency field promotion to acting purser by a visibly shaken Captain Daniel Reyes. No relation to the officer. Simply, the substitute captain rushed to the gate in 11 minutes flat. Approached with a blanket. "Miss Calloway," Maya said quietly, "I'm so sorry about what happened. Can I get you anything?" "Just quiet, Maya," Josephine said, already closing her eyes. "And thank you for asking." 4 hours over the Atlantic, Josephine woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the particular, specific silence of a cabin that had transformed entirely in her sleep. Maya was standing a respectful distance from the suite door, her uniform sharp, her nerves visibly settling into a confidence that hadn't been available to her that morning. "Good afternoon, Miss Calloway. We're about 3 hours from Heathrow." "Coffee." "Black, the way you asked before you fell asleep." "You remembered," Josephine said, sitting up.
How's the cabin, honestly?
Maya smiled. "This is the best flight I've ever worked. Everyone's relaxed. Nobody's afraid of getting yelled at in the galley." Josephine nodded, took the coffee, and opened her laptop. Desmond Wright's face appeared on the screen. Within seconds, tired but wired. The war room behind him lit up, with monitors flashing red and green. "I hope you enjoyed the nap," he said, "because the entire internet is on fire." "Show me," Josephine said. He shared his screen. At 7:52 that morning, 48 minutes after Flight 14 pushed back from the gate, cell phone footage from the business class cabin had leaked onto every platform that mattered. The video of Charlene Voss and Captain Holt being walked off the aircraft by Port Authority had been viewed 900,000 times in 3 hours. A hashtag, Seat2A, was trending nationally. "Public reaction is overwhelmingly in our favor," Desmond said, pulling up a sentiment chart. "People love watching an arrogant captain and a snobby purser get walked off a plane. But there's a complication."
Preston?
Josephine guessed. Exactly. He didn't slink off quietly. He called his PR firm the second he was off the jet bridge, and they've already planted a story with a financial outlet claiming you suffered some kind of breakdown mid-acquisition and unlawfully detained passengers. Shareholders in the legacy Windrose stock are getting nervous. We've seen a small dip. Josephine sipped her coffee and, rather than looking angry, looked almost amused. Preston was playing checkers. She had been playing something closer to chess since before she landed. "He's forgetting one detail about this fleet," she said.
What detail?
Desmond frowned. Windrose installed a cloud-synced cabin communication system. 3 years ago, Josephine said, already typing, specifically to monitor crew disputes after a lawsuit nobody outside legal ever heard about. Every interphone call between the gate, the galley, and the cockpit gets recorded and beamed straight to the mainframe in real time. I own that mainframe now. She isolated the audio from 6:50 to 7:20 that morning and sent Desmond a compressed file. This contains Denise talking to Charlene. It also has Charlene talking to Captain Holt. Send it to the Federal Aviation Administration and to the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Office. Then, post the raw file to Callaway Continental's official account. No caption, just the audio. Desmond played it back on his end, and even through a video call, Josephine could see his eyebrows lift. "This is a smoking gun," he said. "Premeditated fraud, breach of contract, discrimination in favor of an unticketed VIP over a paying passenger. This ends whatever narrative Preston's team is trying to build." "Send it," Josephine said. "Let it burn." "Already done," Desmond said, and for the first time all morning, he smiled the way people smile when they know exactly how a fight is going to end. "There's something else," Desmond added, quieter now, pulling up a second file. "Legal ran a pattern search on old complaint logs once we got server access. Seat 2A specifically. In the last 4 years, 3 other passengers filed formal complaints about being downgraded from that exact seat under almost identical circumstances, always to accommodate a member of Windrose's old preferred client list, always without documented cause. 2 of the 3 passengers were black. 1 was a disabled veteran traveling on a companion pass. All 3 complaints were closed by the same signature, Charlene Voss." Josephine sat with that for a moment, feeling something colder than anger settle into her chest. The particular, specific weight of learning that a single bad morning was never really a single bad morning at all, just the one that happened to a person with the resources to answer back. "Reopen all 3, she said. "Contact every one of them personally. Full refunds, formal apologies, and ask each of them what would actually make it right, not what we think will make it disappear fastest." "On it," Desmond said, and for once, neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything left to add. By the time Flight 14 began its descent into Heathrow, the reckoning was well underway. Preston's own public relations firm dropped him as a client within 30 minutes of the audio going public, a move covered by 4 separate business outlets before lunch. The story flipped entirely. Preston Whitmore was no longer a wronged VIP. He was the man who demanded a paying passenger be thrown out of first class for his comfort, caught in his own recorded arrogance. Within a week, the Department of Transportation opened a formal review into Windrose's handling of the incident, and Captain Holt's commercial leisure certification was suspended pending investigation, not permanently revoked, but functionally career-ending at his age. Charlene Voss found herself unemployable across the luxury aviation sector. Every reference call ended the same way, with a hiring manager thanking her for her time and never calling back. Denise Falk, whose only real sin had been following an order she'd flagged as improper, was the one person from that jet bridge who received a call from Callaway Continental's new Human Resources division 3 weeks later, offering her a position at a different subsidiary, in a role where good judgment would finally be rewarded instead of punished. Watch for that thread. It matters more than it seems right now. At 11:40 that morning London time, the Boeing 787 touched down at Heathrow. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, Maya approached the suite. "Miss Calloway, there's a press gaggle waiting at arrivals." Officer Reyes radioed ahead. Apparently, so did half of Twitter. "Would you like us to arrange a private exit?" Josephine looked out the window at the gray London sky. She had spent a decade building her company in the shadows, letting the work speak instead of her face. Today, the shadows weren't an option anymore, and some quiet part of her, the part that still carried her father's keyring on a duffel bag zipper, decided didn't want them to be. "No, Maya," she said, standing, straightening her hoodie. "I'll walk through the terminal like everyone else." She hadn't changed. Still the faded gray hoodie, the leggings, the sneakers that had seen 100 better mornings. She cleared customs, pushed through the frosted glass doors into the arrivals hall, and the explosion of camera flashes was immediate and blinding. Over 60 reporters were crammed behind a rope line, microphones bearing the logos of every major financial network extended toward her like a forest of black stalks. "Miss Calloway, can you confirm the leaked audio? Did you really fire an entire flight crew 90 minutes after closing the acquisition? Are you concerned about a lawsuit from Captain Holt?" Josephine stopped walking. The hall quieted, everyone straining to catch her first public words since the deal closed. She stepped up to the closest cluster of microphones. And here is a rhetorical question worth sitting with, the same one she would later be asked in 100 think pieces. How do you find the composure to speak calmly to 60 cameras 4 hours after being called a disturbance on your own airplane? "I acquired Windrose Airlines because it had beautiful assets attached to a failing business model," she said, her voice carrying easily over the noise. "But beautiful assets are worthless if the culture running them is rotten underneath. This morning, I experienced firsthand a culture that believed dignity was a commodity, something that could be bought by whoever bid highest and denied to whoever didn't look the part." She looked directly into the nearest camera lens. "Let me be clear. Under Callaway Continental, wealth does not buy you the right to treat another human being like they're invisible. A title doesn't grant immunity from consequences. Any employee, from a gate agent to a captain, who discriminates against a passenger will be removed. We're calling it the Callaway Standard, and it isn't a threat. It's our new baseline." A reporter from a national business paper pushed forward. "What about Preston Whitmore? He says he's taking his business elsewhere." Josephine allowed herself a small, sharp smile. "Mr. Whitmore is permanently banned from every property Callaway Continental owns. He isn't taking his business elsewhere. He's being shown the door out of a sandbox he never should have assumed was his." She took no further questions. Flanked by airport security, she walked out through the terminal and into a waiting black sedan, and as the car pulled away into London traffic, she finally let out a long, quiet breath, closed her eyes, and let her head rest against the cool leather seat. Callaway Continental stock had risen 11% by the time she checked her phone. Windrose Airlines was fully, unmistakably hers, and every employee left on that payroll now understood exactly whose name was on the paperwork. 6 months later, the story had mostly faded from headlines, the way most viral moments do, replaced by whatever outrage came next. But inside Windrose Airlines, the changes hadn't faded at all. They had settled in, quietly, the way real change usually does, long after the cameras stop caring. Captain Daniel Reyes, the substitute pilot rushed in that morning, had been formally promoted to Windrose's chief pilot, a role in which he personally rewrote the crew conduct training after sitting through hours of recorded testimony from other passengers who came forward. Once the story broke, 3 of them, in the end, describing eerily similar treatment stretching back 4 years, each one previously dismissed as an isolated complaint, each one now part of a pattern nobody at the old airline had ever bothered to notice, or wanted to. Maya Okafor was still flying, now training new crew members in a program called, without much subtlety, the ground level standard. The idea that no employee, from the ramp to the cockpit, was worth less respect than any passenger in any seat. Denise Falk had taken the offer from Callaway Continental's Human Resources Division and, 8 months in, had been promoted twice. Her instinct for flagging bad policy finally treated as an asset instead of an inconvenience. Charlene Voss never worked in aviation again. What she did do, 11 months after that morning on the jet bridge, was write a letter. Not to Josephine, not for publicity, but to a former colleague who'd once quietly warned her that her instincts about who deserved respect were badly calibrated. In it, she admitted, for the first time in her career, that she had spent 23 years assuming she could read a person's worth from their clothes, and that she had been wrong every single time it counted. She never sent that letter to Josephine. She didn't need to. Somewhere a copy found its way into a journalism student's research paper on the incident, and Josephine read it once, quietly, at her desk, and set it down without comment. Some kinds of understanding arrive too late to fix anything, and are still worth having anyway. Captain Holt's story ended differently, and less gently. He never wrote a letter. In the one interview he agreed to, 8 months after the suspension, he described the entire morning as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media, and insisted, on camera, that any captain worth his stripes would have made the same call with the information he had at the time. The clip did not help him. It followed him into every subsequent job application, a permanent footnote beneath a resume that used to open every door in the industry without a second glance. He is, as far as anyone at Windrose knows, still convinced he did nothing wrong. Some people carry their certainty all the way to the bottom and never once look down to see how far they've fallen. The 3 passengers, whose old complaints had been reopened, each responded differently to Desmond's call. The disabled veteran asked for nothing beyond an apology and a formal note in his file correcting the record, which he received within the week. One of the 2 black passengers, a soft-spoken architect from Charlotte, asked only that Windrose publish an internal report on what had happened to her case and why it had been closed without investigation, a report that now forms the first page of the airline's public conduct policy. The 3rd passenger never responded to the calls at all, and Josephine let that be, understanding that some people simply want to be done with an airline entirely, and that closure sometimes looks like silence rather than resolution. Preston Whitmore's fund lost 18% of its investor base within the year, not because of the money he'd lost on that flight, but because the audio of his voice snapping his fingers at a flight attendant while ignoring a paying customer became, for a certain kind of investor, an unforgettable data point about how he treated people with no power over him. He sent Josephine a letter too, eventually. Not an apology, exactly, but close enough to one that she noticed the difference between him and Captain Holt, who to this day maintains in interviews that he was simply following protocol. Preston's letter admitted, in careful lawyer-reviewed language, that he had mistaken proximity to money for a kind of permission, and that the version of himself in that recording was not one he was proud to have played back to his own children. Josephine never responded, but she kept the letter the same way she kept her father's old condolence letter with his name spelled wrong in the same drawer for reasons she never fully explained to anyone, including herself. As for Josephine, she still flies economy sometimes when the mood strikes her, just to remember what it feels like from that seat. She still wears the hoodie. The small brass airplane still hangs from the zipper of a duffel bag that has flown more miles than most people manage in a lifetime. A quiet reminder clipped to canvas that the people who build an airline and the people who own one are not always the faces you expect, and that dignity was never supposed to be for sale in the first place. If this story moved something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, maybe even a version of yourself, go ahead and like it so it finds the person who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's ever been made to feel invisible in a room they had every right to stand in. And leave a comment telling me this. Have you ever stood in that cabin, in that moment? And if you have, which side of it were you on? I read every single one.